Thank you very much. Well, thank you all very much for coming. It's always a pleasure to talk at the library. I can almost see my house from here. I think that the stuff I write is quite hybrid very often. It's a bit of this, a bit of that. Some people say not nearly enough of the other, but this book is very much a mixture. So let me tell you how it started. I just turned 50, and by complete chance, I came across, whilst looking for something else, which is how you find anything worth finding in my experience, a woman called Fanny Trollope, who came from the same rather disreputable area of Bristol in the West Country that I come from. And when she just turned 50, she went to America. Now, this was 1827. That's really early. It's before even de Tocqueville. And she didn't go to swan around. She went for economic salvation. She was Anthony Trollope's mother. And she wrote a book when she got back called Domestic Manners of the Americans, and it became a huge international bestseller and made her a superstar, and has never been out of print in America or in Britain. But here's the thing. She had this useless husband and millions of children, and she went to America for economic salvation to make some money. You know, it was very much the fabled democracy that, you know, Britain didn't have, and the new republic, and pretty much newly still independent, certainly within her lifetime, it had become independent. It was the land of new starts, the land of promise. Nobody knew what it was. She said, when I went to America, it was no more known than fairyland, and she used a plural verb for the United States. So she sets off, taking 3 children with her, and left 2 behind, one of which was Anthony, who was at boarding school, and they couldn't pay his fees, and he was terribly miserable. And she went up, and it took 6 weeks to get to America then, and she travelled steerage on a steamship, and sail ship, because you couldn't travel by steam the whole way across then, so she sailed, and went up the Mississippi in a steamship, and ended up in Cincinnati, where she had all sorts of ideas of how she would found some businesses and make money. And they all failed completely. And she was pretty much destitute 3.5 years later when she came back. One of her daughters had no shoes, and just failure all around. And she wrote this book. And so America was the promised land in the end, after all. It did deliver the second act, just didn't while she was there. And I thought this was rather an interesting story from all kinds of points of view. One is, you know, America is supposed to be the land of second acts, even though Scott Fitzgerald said the opposite. There were no second acts in American lives, he said. But for people from Europe, it was a chance for a new start. And in fact, after her, it was when people really started pouring in the course of the 19th century. So I thought it was interesting that she'd done that so early, and a woman travelling on her own was very unusual then. This sort of Bristolian middle-age, and also the fact of reinvention as a middle-aged woman is quite unusual. And, you know, we live in a very youth-obsessed culture, and being that age myself attracted my attention of somebody who had completely rediscovered themselves in her 50s. So I thought that I would do some research into her, which I did. But I was really only interested in her in America. So I didn't want to write a whole book about her, and I certainly didn't want to write a biography. When she came back from America and got all this money, she wrote 40 extremely bad novels and went swanning around the courts of Europe, and half her children died. And anyway, that was the sort of thing that didn't really interest me that much. And so I started investigating how I could expand the story to take in the things I was interested in. One was America during that period. I first went to America about 32 years ago, and I've always really liked it, even as the rest of the world gets on with its cordial loathing. I reckon I've travelled across about half the states, about 27 states. And I've always wanted to write something about it, but I didn't know what. And I discovered this 50-year period, starting with Fanny Trollope, 1827, and going on to 1877. The significance of 1877 is that's when the rails joined America together, and America became America. And I found that it stopped being so interesting then. The 20th century, of course, was the American one. Now we're in the post-American century. But the 19th century, that was when America was becoming itself. And I thought that the idea of a country becoming itself, and at the same time as a middle-aged woman rediscovering herself, And one thing led to another. And looking back now, because this book, Oh My America, is a proof copy, is the story of 6 middle-aged English women writers who went to America during that 50-year period to reinvent themselves. Looking back now, it seems that the other 5 dropped out of the skies onto my desk. But of course it wasn't like that. As I say, one thing leads to another. The second one who in the book is someone called Fanny Kemble, and to a certain extent hers is the most interesting story, I think. And also I think she was probably the one that was most like me in many ways in temperament. She was a extremely famous and glamorous young actress who at the age of 22 took the English stage by storm, playing Juliet. It was the era of all those famous dynasties of actors, actor managers. And her father was Charles Kemble, who ran the Drury Lane Theatre and the Covent Garden Theatre, one after the other. And her aunt was Sarah Siddons. It was the era of the Garricks and all of that lot. And the theatre got into a lot of trouble, and so Fanny Kemble was dragooned by her father to bolster the fortunes of his theatre. And she was a massive hit, and became a celebrity, although it was a more glamorous business then. This is about 1830, and there was sort of the equivalent of mugs printed with her picture on, and in fact there were mugs printed with her picture on, and there was fans in the front row called Kemblers, and anyway, she was a superstar. Didn't much care for acting, but she did it for duty. Anyway, the father then decided that to bolster the exchequer, the family exchequer, they would go on tour in America. So they went on, she toured as Juliet with her father playing Romeo, which is not for the squeamish. And again, a huge success, front page news. This was up and down the East Coast, which was what America was then, really. New York, Boston, Philadelphia. Supposed to go down as far as Charleston, but trouble was brewing. And she rather took to America. Again, Kemblers, the hotel room full of young men with bouquets. Cut a long story short, one of these fans wooed her, and she gave it all up for love, and she married him. Well, this was a marriage made somewhere south of heaven. He was a very rich man from Philadelphia, but he was a southerner at heart, and he was very much pro the Confederacy, and he was a slave owner. He had 600 slaves in the Georgia Sea Islands. And they produced she got very bored very quickly, and they went to live on the Sea Islands and the plantations were not Tara. And she was a sort of liberal and an abolitionist and disaster. And the Sea Islands, which are off coastal Georgia, this very miasmic region, they haven't changed very much actually between then and now, which is like the sort of Venice of North America, that they're all slightly sort of neither land nor sea, very sort of miasmic, sinking, basically tons of sand held together by reeds like nets, but very good for cotton. Sea Island cotton was the best cotton in the world. And so Fanny Kemble had this terribly miserable time, non-stop fighting, pleading the slaves' causes with her husband. He didn't think of slaves as humans, disaster all round. He had lots of affairs, there was duels. In the end, divorce. Of course, he got custody because a woman didn't get anything then. And in the end, she went back to England with her tail between her legs and had to leave the girls behind. And she didn't write much about that because she didn't want to alienate him further until the Civil War started brewing. So there she was, by this time a stout lady in her 50s in America, in England, and she decided that she wanted to write something in order to further the Yankee cause, because the Yankees, of course, were abolitionists. So she wrote this book called A Journal of a Residence on a Georgia Plantation, which has got to be one of the best first-hand accounts of slavery ever written. It's absolutely brilliant. And Southern historians still now say that she lost them the Civil War because she did really influence opinion in Britain at a time where it was far from certain who the British would support in the war. And so tremendous success. And again, here's somebody in their 50s really doing something that dramatically changes both their own life and, in her case, the world in general. And she sailed into a very dignified old age. And I thought that her story, particularly the tale she told, this sort of appalling first-hand account of slavery, and a sort of woman's story in a man's world. These were all women operating in a man's world, and she, more than anyone else in the sort of southern era, because it was the era of rank magnolias and crinolines still. And then, but my third woman was somebody who was a very well-known in the age, and still now well-known among scholars, a social reformer called Harriet Martineau. She's a social theorist, and terribly famous in her day. Everybody beat a path to her door, Darwin and the Prime Minister, and she wrote pamphlets on self-improvement, everything from learning how everybody had to learn how to swim to, the sight of a farm labourer would produce 300 pages on the plight of rural workers, and she did a lot of stuff, good stuff for the labour movement. But she was a very feisty and interesting woman. She was a Unitarian. She came from the east, from the Fenlands, where a lot of Unitarians hid out. And she moved to London as soon as she could, and sort of lost her faith, really, but was an extremely hard worker, rather unfortunate looking, as everybody noted, a lifelong spinster. And her work, really, of which there's a huge amount, as I say, unreadable, I don't recommend it, but really has been commandeered by the dead hand of academia, and endless PhDs and academic books written about her and her work. And I thought that was a pity, because I thought there was a lot more to her than that. And she too, in middle age, reinvented herself and spent a lot of time in America writing some quite interesting stuff on her observations of this big new democracy that people at home were a little bit frightened about. And what all my girls noted was how Americans at the time were extremely sensitive about the opinion Europeans had of them. Of course, they're a young country. Young countries always are. It's like young countries we've seen in our own lifetime. And they all used to say, oh, well, I don't suppose you... I mean, when Fanny Trollope went to see the hustings of an election, they said, oh, I don't suppose you do things quite so democratically over there. Very critical of the trappings of the class system in the old world. And all my girls wrote about that, and sort of they saw the beginnings of another kind of class system based on money, which as it turns out, was sort of quite prophetic, really. And you can see how that sort of breaking away from, I felt I could see through what they'd written, that breaking away from the roots of the societies that those people had come from, and creating a classless society, there had to be something hierarchical, and it was money even then. So Harriet Martineau, when she got to DC, on her first day in the boarding house, 600 callers in stovepipe hats left their cards for her, and she had dinner with the president on the first night, President Jackson on the first night, and they hung on her every word. And what I did for all of these 6 women was I followed in their footsteps as far as I could. I tried to avoid the cities because, they changed too much. But what was surprising to me is how much of the sticks, the countryside, was really as they'd seen it. And Harriet Martineau spent a lot of time in Kentucky. And so did I. And, the bluegrass world and the Kentucky rivers and so on, and the things she saw, I could follow her steps exactly. And you would see me there with 2 maps. I got good old Stanfords to produce the maps of the 1820s, 1830s and 1840s. So I would have those maps, which obviously there'd be sort of huge splodges where it just would say Cherokee country. And then you'd see me in a car park with stones on the corners, and then a Rand McNally, stones on the corners, and tracing with my finger where they'd been. And it gave me some insight into what they'd seen. And Kentucky was a particularly revealing experience for me, as it was for her. Of course, in her day, it was the northernmost of the southern states, right next to that border with Ohio, which was quite porous. A lot of slaves escaped, of course, not quite the railways then, but a lot of slaves did escape over the border. And in fact, Fanny Trollope was in Cincinnati in Ohio, used this as her main argument about the hypocrisy of this vaunted American democracy, because she said, standing on the river, on the banks of the River Ohio where she lived, you could see them raising the cap of liberty on one side, she said, and on the other bank beating their slaves. So what kind of democracy was this? So all kinds of issues like that were raised. And Harriet Martineau, when she'd finished with America and produced several thousand pages, literally, on the subject of America, the New Democracy, she retired to the Lake District to write a few thousand pages on lots of other subjects. And when she was 59, her doctor said that she had an illness and she was going to die. So she immediately sat down and wrote her own obituary, walked to the post box and posted it to the Daily News, instructing them not to publish it until she was actually dead. And she proceeded to lead a very vigorous life for the next 20 years. And when she finally expired, this obituary was published. And I went to her house, in fact, that she had built herself in the Lake District, which is that wonderful grey Westmoreland stone. And her neighbours were the Wordsworths and the Arnolds and all kinds of sort of literary folk, and they would exchange visits, and they all wrote about her quite a lot in their diaries, not always in a very complimentary way. I think she talked non-stop, and that sort of slightly bored them to tears. Anyway, by this time of writing this book, I realised that I really had to have a homesteader. And the homesteaders, of course, were the women who made America and Canada, who emigrated usually because they were too poor to make a living as tenant farmers. Just basically sort of turned up in the middle of nowhere. And while I was looking for something else in the British Library manuscript room, I came across a book written by a woman from Yorkshire called Rebecca Burlend. And she and her husband were very poor tenant farmers in Ailments on Berwick, or is it Berwick on Ailment, not far from Leeds. And the price of corn collapsed. And they had 7 children, and they were all, really almost destitute. And it was just about that time, in about 1845, when poor people were talking about moving to America and basically turning the black earth of middle America, starting from nothing. And there was another man from their part of Yorkshire whose brother had done this, and this brother wrote letters, and they literally sold everything they had and left the 2 eldest kids behind, and they went to Western Illinois, where this other bloke from Yorkshire was. And again, 6 weeks in steerage, she was breastfeeding up the Mississippi, down the River Illinois, and they'd been told to get off at this special place called Parris Landing. And when they got off there was just nothing. It was just black earth. And they all sat down and burst into tears, and Rebecca said, "Is this America?" And they had leased a bit of land. And for the first 2 years, they literally ploughed by hand because they had no oxen. Terribly cold in Western Illinois in winter. These 5 kids, lots of shysters roaming around. It was the Wild West. It was the frontier. All of my girls really were on the frontier. Cincinnati was the frontier in 1827 when Fanny Trollope got there. And my book really follows the frontier west until it reaches California. And after about 2 years of this sort of agonising, excruciating toil, they realised that they were going to just about be okay. They had a few neighbours, a few miles apart, and they would swap bowls of milk for, tin cups. And every week, Rebecca's husband, John, would walk to the store. This wonderful image of the horses stamping outside and the steam blowing from their noses and the men inside drinking neat alcohol with a tincture of cinnamon in it, and the women wrapping up their parcels. And after 2 years, they just about, had enough to eat, and things got better, and they ended up being quite comfortable. And she eventually, when she was about 65, returned to England for a holiday. Her 2 eldest children were there, and this school teacher said, "Come on, Mum, you've got to write this, or we've got to write all this down." She was pretty much illiterate. So she told him her story, and he wrote it down, and it was privately printed in Yorkshire. And I found a copy, and it's just basically the story of this woman who refused to give up. And what I really admired about her was even in, her husband fell on a scythe and got a bad injury, and then she had to bring the corn in, cutting it by hand. And she would say even then that it was so beautiful, the landscape was so beautiful, particularly when it was frosted, and these wide open skies of the Midwest. And she used the Northwest, it was called then. And she says she often used to lean against the lintel at night and just look out and wonder at how incredibly beautiful it was. Very devout faith. And I felt that she was an inspiration, really, never give up. In fact, the working title of this book was No Surrender. because they never did give up in the face of amazing adversity, which when you think what they were battling against on all sorts of fronts, let alone that they were in this man's world. And Rebecca was the only one in whose footsteps I didn't follow, because she didn't really travel. She went to this one place in Western Illinois and stayed there. And it's, industrialised now. The corn she planted is owned by, multinationals. But I was thinking one day, I bet that she had all these children. It's quite an unusual name. Surely there must be some there. And by the end of that day, the internet was made for things like that. By the end of that day, I was conversing with her great-great-great-grandson, John Burlend, and he sent me a photograph of himself standing next to her grave. And indeed, there were Burlends fanned out all over Western Illinois, and that was her legacy. So my fifth woman was the only one really I knew beforehand, because she was quite a well-known, one of those Victorian tweed skirts, who sort of, the tweed-skirted spinsters who battled across lofty pamirs or, across swamps wearing a big heavy skirt, parasols aloft, followed by sort of 100 factotums. And her name was Isabella Bird, and she was the first woman who became a fellow of the Royal Geographical Society here in London. But she also had that weird neurasthenic thing that so many of those Victorian lady travellers had, that she was always ill at home, really ill, bedridden. And the minute she got onto a ship, she sort of rose like Lazarus and sort of rode on her own around the world for a year, came back, and on the ship coming back, became ill again. And it obviously was some sort of neurasthenia, because I think, there was no life for them at home. They were confined to the parlours. There was no life if you were an independent woman, didn't have a family, didn't have any children. She was a spinster, Isabella Bird. And she's really most known, I'd say, for her travels in Asia. But I discovered that she had spent quite a lot of time in Colorado when it was the frontier. But it was really not even the frontier. It really was the Wild West. And there were no maps. I had no map for her, and she didn't have a map either. And she wrote this amazing book called A Lady's Life in the Rocky Mountains. And I followed her footsteps there, which was really wonderful. Going over the Front Range, that's where she was, the Front Range of the Rockies, sort of northwest of Denver. And she found what she was looking for, which was freedom. And she fell in love with a one-eyed desperado called Rocky Mountain Jim, who had one eye, blue as a gas jet, which he told her he'd lost to a grizzly bear. But that was a pork pie like everything else he said. And they had this wonderful, I think, unconsummated love affair by the flickering campfire, when everybody else was asleep, and they were nestled up to the animals. And it was the high point of her life, really. And she was devastated when she left, and so was he. But she had to go back home. Her father was a vicar, she was a daughter of the Mants. They lived in Edinburgh. And she and her sister, who was also a spinster, did charitable works. Tried to persuade the crofters of Tobermory to give up alcohol was one of their failed schemes. But they did good works. Usually Isabella directing it from her sickbed. And sure enough, on the ship on the way back from Colorado, she again fell ill. And her sister died shortly thereafter, and she was so heartbroken that she married her sister's doctor. And there was a sort of immolation of the marital bed. She wore black to her wedding and went completely downhill until he expired, which seemed to perk her up. And she then went around the world a few more times and came back, and then by this time had written a lot of books and was very much recognised by the establishment, who, in those days, if you really did something very unusual as a woman, if you did it enough in a man's way, you were accepted by the establishment, and she was. So I thought hers was an interesting story, and she was a very accomplished writer in many ways. So my sixth girl is completely unknown, really. And I found her again when I was looking for something else, when I was at the Jane Austen archive. I suspect some of you have been there, at Chawton in Hampshire, Jane Austen's house. And it's rather a lovely place, and everybody talks about Jane. All the office staff talk about Jane, as if she just popped out to do the photocopying. And I was looking through this archival material and found all these letters from California in 1875. I thought, God, that's early. just, the train had only just got there. And it turned out that they were from her niece. She had a lot of nephews and nieces, Jane Austen. But this niece, her name was Catherine Hubback. She was born in Austen. She was Uncle Francis's daughter. And she had a useless husband. Useless husband's quite a theme of this book. And I've been going around doing the publicity, and my own husband said to me, I've just heard you on the radio so often talking about all these useless husbands and how you followed in these women's footsteps. And he said, I'm beginning to feel a little bit self-conscious. So now I feel obliged to add a caveat that that wasn't anything to do with my own story. There is a lot about my own journey and about the sort of reinvention of women entering. I was interested in women entering that sort of barren land, the post-fertile years. It's got quite a closed book, really, and it's very grey, and these were, perceived as being very grey, and it's very unzeitgeisty, the sort of youth culture, and, it's the age of becoming invisible. A lot of my girlfriends sort of, in their 50s sort of say they feel they've become invisible, and it's, and these 6, I felt they were like birds of paradise in that sort of so-called grey landscape. And, they showed me, and I hope will show some of my readers, that, that's a myth, really, that grey, post-fertile land that's somehow been created since always, really. I've noticed in my travels around the world over the years that indigenous cultures usually have the sort of terminology and the myths and the images they have about women post-childbirth are almost to do with death, really, as from the Inuit sort of leaving them out on an ice floe and going off without them. And it's regrettable. And maybe one thing about evolution and progress is that we can get beyond that. Anyway, so in a way that's what Oma America is about. It's about how it doesn't have to be like that, and maybe it never has been like that. And here are these 6 birds of paradise to show us. Anyway, Catherine Hubback. She married a very promising barrister, very clever man, actually, and moved to London and lived the high life. Had 3 sons in short order. And then he went bonkers. He went completely bonkers, sort of old-fashioned bonkers, and went into an asylum from which he never emerged. So she struggled on, and she started writing novels to earn some money, which in those days had to be massive triple-decker novels. They had to be 3 volumes to satisfy the travelling libraries. Pretty terrible, but she had a certain readership and is written of in certain quarters and made her a bit of money. But the trouble was that as a woman of her state, she didn't have any status. If you were a spinster, you had a certain status. If you're a widow, you had a certain status. But as a married woman with no husband, it was all very awkward. Nobody ever invited. She couldn't do anything. She had no identity. So once the youngest son became an adult, she decided she would go to America quite literally to reinvent herself. She would list herself as a widow, and she would literally have a new identity. And she was one of the sort of first generation to ride the rails to San Francisco. Of course, San Francisco was just exploding. It had been a sleepy fishing village until only a few years previously, until 1849 with the gold rush. And that was the first wave. But you had to be quite a pioneer to get there because you had to go either around one way or over the mountains. So it's a very male city, very lawless, lots of a huge sort of foreign influx of French miners, Chinese miners. Whenever things went badly around in the rest of the world, the 1850s, all the men went to mine in California. And then the railway came, and the second great wave. So it was exploding with life, and it was the perfect place to go and reinvent yourself. And one of her adult sons went there to set up a wheat brokerage. And so her reason for going was to keep house for him until such time as he got married. And she settled in Oakland across the bay and wrote a series of letters home describing what life was like in Oakland. And she did list herself as a widow in the San Francisco directory. And one thing that really interested me was it was the birth of tourism. It was the birth of American tourism. Because Manifest Destiny had really come to a close. the Indians were pretty much taken care of, i.e. killed, all rounded up. And for the first time, Americans started seeing their own landscape as something to be celebrated, not just something to be beaten into submission. Yosemite, not quite the Rockies yet, but certainly the landscape of California. So it was also the age of photography, landscape photography. Very great character who I dragged into my book called Edward Muybridge, who was a brilliant British, English, turned himself into a landscape photographer, changed his name, reinvented himself in Oakland at the same time as Catherine, who was one of her neighbours. So, in fact, what I tried to do with these 6 stories was pick out themes that ran all the way through, and photography was one. It was the sort of birth of photography, and half of them lived to see themselves depicted on paper, and half didn't. And it was a terribly exciting moment when you were first photographed. Even Rebecca, in her old age in Illinois, went into a studio, and there she is, hatchet face, long black dress on. And Catherine Hubback in San Francisco started following the tourist trails. They were the first ones on stagecoaches, to go to Yosemite and Santa Cruz and down the coast and up the coast. So it was a wonderful opportunity for me to follow in her footsteps, particularly up the coast of Northern California, which is, really undeveloped because all the action's on the other side of the big freeway, off inland, and that little slice of coast. Still pretty much as she would have seen it. It's a very fractal landscape, you can see why the earthquakes are there. And, I could see the beaches that she'd walked on when she'd gone in these stagecoaches and up into the volcanic terrain around the Lassen Mineral National Park, as it's now called. And she wrote home about all these things. And really, it was one of the first sort of eyewitness accounts, particularly by a woman, of California after it became part of the country, linked as it was by the railway. And America had become itself, and then the rest of the story. So what I wanted to do was as I said at the beginning, tell the story of these 6 women who witnessed the making of America, and pick up the themes that ran through, follow their footsteps, tell the story of being a middle-aged woman. And I just want to read you, before I ask you to ask me some questions. This is the end of the introduction of the book. I've basically, in the introduction, I'll sort of explain the premise as to why I wrote the book, and pick out some themes, and so this is the conclusion. The other thing I wanted to say is besides these themes I picked out, it's very difficult writing about six different people, and it very much is not a group biography because it's a story of my girls in America. So what I tried to do to sort of give there was seven really, because I was the 7th, my story and theirs. And what I tried to do is I've said to give the book some narrative structure and unity. Let's pick out some themes that go all the way through, and one of those is American fiction of the 20th century, of writing about landscapes I was in, and how those writers were interpreting the landscape as my girls had and as I was. People like Willa Cather, for example, and Erskine Caldwell, and amazing. I mean, I don't know what our lot were doing in the beginning of the 20th century, because we have nothing here in modern English literature, I don't think, compared to just millions of brilliant American writers who were interpreting their landscape, the landscape that my girls had travelled through. And the other thing I tried to pick out was characters who cropped up. I mean, I couldn't go a day without falling over Dickens or Henry James. Henry James was very much like a lot of my girls, sort of a transatlantic figure. He was American, of course, but he was, lived a lot in England, wrote a lot about England. And he was a very, very close friend of Fanny Kemble and met some of the others. And Dickens, of course, went to America, wrote masses about America himself. And he knew several of them and wrote about them, and they wrote about him. So those were sort of signposts throughout the book. Anyway, this is the end of the introduction. And when I've finished reading this, I hope that you will ask me some questions about Oh My America. well, or about anything, really. In short, this is a book about how middle-aged women respond when life puts the boot in, told against the period in which America was establishing both its borders and its identity. After so many years writing about explorers with frozen beards, that's what I have spent a lot of my working life doing, spending my life with women proved a joy. My subject spoke to me across the years, voices from what was once the distant shore of middle age, where women ceased to exist. How suddenly it had come close. All biographers have hidden impulses, and in some sense, I was looking for clues, how to forge forward myself into that colourless land of barren women. I was going through a gloomy phase when I began thinking about this book. The shadow of late middle age, my children needing me less, me needing them more, the wheel turning. Writing Oh My America liberated me. Through it all, on the road and at my desk, my characters were the best company a writer could hope for. Spirited, intelligent, funny and inconsistent. I thought I was the luckiest author in the world to have found them. They were sometimes incontinently human, throwing tantrums, being bossy, running away, and that was when I loved them most, though I did not side with them, just as I try not to side with myself. My goal was always the complete sympathy of complete detachment. There was poetry in the girls' moral dramas, and they made me realise what an unending adventure it is to be human. That is the larger argument that spools through Oh My America. Women like those depicted in these pages exist everywhere. I see their faces every day on the tube. I had more fun writing this book than all my previous books put together. And if I can impart a fraction of that enjoyment to the reader, I will not have entirely failed to honour the spirit of these 6 noble individuals who refused to give up. My working title was No Surrender. After all, dying comes to all of us in the end. Living is the trick.